She stood there with 6 hungry mouths to feed, a dead husband wrapped in canvas, and exactly 3 days before they'd throw her off the land. Then a stranger on horseback appeared on that ridge, and what he said next would change everything. But here's what nobody expected. Her brother would show up with legal papers, a loaded gun, and a claim that could rip those children from her arms forever. This is a story about survival, sacrifice, and one impossible choice made under the brutal Dakota sun. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The heat came first. Not gentle, not gradual. It arrived like a fist, thick, suffocating, pressing down on the Dakota plains with the weight of divine punishment. By mid-morning, the sun had already bleached the sky white, turning the horizon into a shimmering liquid thing that bent and wavered like a mirage. The kind of heat that made breathing feel like drowning, the kind that cracked the earth open and left it gasping. Mara Fielding stood in the center of her yard, if you could call it that, with her youngest child balanced on one hip and a sack of flour digging into her opposite shoulder. The baby, not yet 2, screamed directly into her ear, his face red and slick with tears and sweat. She barely heard him anymore. The sound had become part of the landscape, like the wind or the crows or the relentless, punishing sun. Her bare feet shifted in the dust. She'd sold her shoes 3 weeks ago, traded them for a tin of lard and a bag of cornmeal that was already half gone. Her dress, once blue, now a faded gray-brown that matched the dirt, clung to her back, soaked through with perspiration that never seemed to dry. It just sat there, cold and clammy against her skin, even in the heat. Behind her, the house leaned. Not figuratively, it actually leaned, tilting to the left like a drunk man trying to stay upright after his 10th whiskey. The porch sagged in the middle, the boards warped and splintered. 2 of the windows had no glass, just tattered flour sacks nailed across the frames to keep the worst of the dust out. The roof had more holes than shingles, and when it rained, which it hadn't in 43 days, you could hear the water drumming on the floor inside like a second storm. Mara didn't look at it. She never looked at it anymore. Looking at it meant acknowledging what it represented: failure, poverty, and the slow, inevitable collapse of everything she'd once believed her life could be. 5 more children moved through the yard like ghosts, silent, watchful, hungry. The oldest, Thomas, was 10. He carried a bucket that had rusted through at the bottom, water dribbling out in a thin, pathetic stream as he walked from the well to the house. He didn't speak. Hadn't spoken much since his father died. Next came the twins, Sarah and Samuel, 8 years old and so thin their elbows and knees looked swollen in comparison to their stick-thin limbs. They sat in the shade of the one remaining tree, a gnarled cottonwood that offered more memory of shade than actual relief. Sarah plaited her sister's hair with fingers that trembled from hunger. Samuel stared at nothing. Then there was Lily, 6, who followed Mara everywhere like a shadow, her hand perpetually reaching for the hem of her mother's dress. And finally, Joseph, 4, who'd stopped asking when they'd eat and now just sat in the dirt, drawing circles with a stick, his eyes vacant and glassy. 6 children, 1 dead husband, and a future that looked like a noose tightening by the hour. Mara shifted the flour sack higher on her shoulder and started walking toward the house. Each step sent up a small cloud of dust that hung in the air, suspended in the heat. The baby continued to wail, his small fists beating against her collarbone, but she didn't try to soothe him. What was the point? She had nothing to give him. No milk, no comfort, just the same empty reassurances she'd been whispering for weeks. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Lies, all of it. Beautiful, necessary lies. Her husband lay behind the smokehouse. Not buried, not yet. The ground was too hard, baked solid by the sun and the drought that had turned the entire territory into a monument to God's indifference. She'd tried digging, spent 2 full days with a shovel that had a cracked handle, attacking the earth with the kind of desperate fury that comes from grief and exhaustion. She'd managed to get down maybe 8 inches before her hands bled through the blisters and her back seized up so badly she couldn't stand. So now he just waited, wrapped in a canvas tarp that had once covered their wagon, tied with rope, laid out in the shade behind the smokehouse where the smell wouldn't reach the children when the wind shifted. She'd placed rocks on top to keep the animals away, but she could hear them at night, coyotes and foxes, maybe even wolves, scratching and sniffing, testing the barriers she'd built. Every morning she woke up terrified that she'd find him torn apart. Every morning she checked, and every morning, by some miracle, he was still there, still whole, still waiting for a grave she couldn't give him. The guilt was a living thing. It moved through her veins like poison, slow and hot and constant. A good wife would have found a way. A good wife would have dug through stone if she had to. But Mara's hands were shaking too hard to hold the shovel anymore, and her body was failing in ways that terrified her. She could feel herself coming apart at the seams, physically, mentally, spiritually, like a dress that had been mended too many times, held together by threads that were finally giving out. She reached the porch steps and paused, her vision swimming. The heat pressed down on her skull like hands, crushing, insistent. For a moment she thought she might faint, thought she might just crumble right there, fold up like paper and let the wind take her. But then Lily's small hand found hers, and she felt the girl's fingers, thin, fragile, trusting, wrap around her own. "Mama?" The word was soft, questioning, afraid. Mara forced herself to breathe, to focus, to stay standing. "I'm all right, baby," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "I'm all right." Another lie. But Lily seemed to accept it, her small face relaxing just slightly. She pressed herself against Mara's side, and they stood there together in the brutal sun, two figures melting into the landscape of dust and desperation. That's when she saw him. At first he was just a shape, a dark silhouette cresting the ridge to the north, wavering in the heat shimmer like something from a dream. Mara squinted, her heart rate picking up. Riders meant trouble. Always. They meant debt collectors or land speculators or men looking to take advantage of a woman alone. In the 6 weeks since her husband died, 3 different men had stopped by with offers that were really threats, suggestions that were really demands. She'd turned them all away with her father's old rifle and a voice that shook but didn't break. But each time it got harder. Each time she felt the ground beneath her feet growing less solid. The rider came closer. A man. Alone. On a gray horse that moved with the steady, patient gait of an animal that had traveled far and wasn't in any particular hurry. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun, and even from a distance she could see the dust coating his clothes, turning him the same color as the land itself. Mara's grip tightened on the baby, who had finally stopped crying and now simply whimpered against her shoulder, exhausted. Her eyes flicked to the house, to the rifle propped just inside the door. Too far. If he meant harm, she wouldn't reach it in time. So she stood, waiting, watching. Her body tense as wire. The man reached the edge of her property, what was left of it anyway. The fence had fallen down months ago, the posts rotted through. Now there was just a vague line where her land theoretically ended and the open range began. But in practice, it was all the same, empty, worthless, forgotten. He stopped his horse about 20 feet away, didn't dismount, didn't speak, just sat there, looking at her, at the children, at the house tilting behind them like a bad joke. Mara lifted her chin. She'd learned that much, how to fake courage even when your legs were shaking so hard you could barely stand. "Keep riding," she called out. Her voice sounded stronger than she expected. "We got nothing here." The man didn't move. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but she could feel his eyes on her, assessing, calculating. "I said keep riding." She took a step forward, putting herself between the stranger and her children. The baby whimpered again, sensing her tension. "We don't need whatever you're selling, and we got no money for charity." Still, he didn't move. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was about to turn, to make a run for the rifle, when the man finally spoke. "Ain't selling nothing." His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that had spent years in wind and weather. "And ain't offering charity neither." "Then what do you want?" A pause, long enough that she wondered if he'd answer at all. Then, "Saw you from the ridge." He shifted slightly in the saddle, and she caught a glimpse of his face, weathered, stubbled, with eyes that looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Carrying all that, all them kids, all by yourself." "So?" The word came out sharp, defensive. "What's it to you?" "Nothing, I suppose." He looked away, out across the plains, then back at her. Except, nobody should have to carry that alone. Mara felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, just crack. A small fissure in the wall she'd built around herself, the one that kept her upright, kept her moving, kept her from collapsing completely. She swallowed hard. "We're fine." "Are you?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and brutal and completely without judgment, and that was somehow worse than if he'd been cruel. Cruelty she could fight against. Cruelty gave her something to push back on. But this quiet, sincere concern from a complete stranger, it threatened to undo her completely. "We're managing," she said, but her voice had gone thin, uncertain. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud, sending up small puffs of dust. He held his hands out slightly, palms forward, a gesture of peace, or maybe surrender. "Name's Caleb Rourke," he said. "I got a place about 15 miles west of here. Small, nothing fancy, but it's got a roof that don't leak and a well that ain't run dry." Mara stared at him. Her mind worked slowly, sluggishly, trying to understand what he was offering, trying to find the trap, the angle, the price. "Why?" she finally managed. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Because I can." "I don't—" She stopped, the words tangling in her throat. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am, you don't." "Then why would you—" "Because I've seen enough in this life to know when someone's drowning." He took a step closer, and she noticed he was careful not to move too quickly, not to startle her. "And I seen enough to know what it looks like when there ain't nobody throwing a rope." Behind Mara, Thomas had appeared on the porch. He held the bucket still, water dripping through the rusted bottom, and watched the stranger with dark, suspicious eyes. The twins had stopped their endless, quiet play and now stood together, hands clasped, staring. Even Joseph had looked up from his drawings in the dirt. Mara felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their hunger, their fear, their desperate, silent hope. And she felt her own body shaking, failing, running on fumes and stubbornness and a will that was rapidly running out. "I don't need your pity," she said, but there was no strength left in it, just exhaustion, just truth. "Ain't pity," Caleb replied quietly. "It's decency. Or maybe just the kind of thing you do because you know what it's like to have nobody." Mara's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears come. Not here, not now, not in front of this stranger who was offering her something she couldn't even name. Salvation, maybe? Or just a brief reprieve from the inevitable. "I got a wagon," Caleb continued. "If you wanted, I could bring it by tomorrow. Help you gather what you need, get you and the young'un somewhere safe." "Safe," Mara repeated. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd once spoken but had long since forgotten. "Yeah." She looked down at the baby in her arms, at Lily pressed against her side, at Thomas on the porch with his broken bucket and his father's eyes, at all of them, these small, fragile lives that depended on her, that needed her to be stronger and smarter and braver than she had any idea how to be. "What's the catch?" she asked. Caleb's expression softened just slightly. "No catch. Oh, just, you can't keep carrying this alone, and I got the means to help, that's all." "That's all," she echoed. It sounded too simple, too good. Too much like the kind of thing that only happened in stories, not in the brutal, unforgiving reality of drought and death and dust. But what choice did she have? Stay here and watch her children waste away? Wait for the next man to ride up, one who might not be so kind, who might take what he wanted without asking, keep pretending she had the strength to do this by herself when every morning she woke up weaker, more hollow, more certain that she was failing? Caleb waited, patient, still, like he had all the time in the world. Mara's voice broke. She closed her eyes, felt the sun burning through her eyelids, and made the only choice left to her. "All right." When she opened her eyes, Caleb was nodding slowly. "I'll be back tomorrow morning. First light. You gather what you can carry, what matters most. I'll bring the wagon." "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand, needing it to make sense. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he glanced past her, to the children, to the dying land, to the house that was more collapse than structure. When his eyes came back to hers, there was something in them she couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe, or memory. "Because somebody should have done it for me once," he said quietly, "and nobody did." Then he turned, mounted his horse with an easy, practiced motion, and rode away. She watched him go, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he was just a dark speck against the endless burning horizon. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Mara felt something besides desperation. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close. Something that whispered maybe, just maybe, they would survive this after all. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay on the thin mattress she shared with 3 of her children. The others were piled together on the floor, on a nest of quilts and worn blankets, and stared at the ceiling. Through the holes in the roof, she could see stars, millions of them, scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on a dark table. Beautiful, indifferent, eternal. She thought about Caleb Rourke, about his quiet voice and his steady eyes, and his inexplicable offer, about the way he'd looked at her, not with judgment or lust or pity, but with something simpler. Recognition, maybe. Like looking in a mirror and seeing your own exhaustion reflected back. Who was he? Why had he come? And more importantly, could she really trust him? The questions circled her mind like vultures, picking at her thoughts until she wanted to scream. But she didn't. Instead, she carefully extracted herself from the tangle of sleeping children and moved to the window, the one with actual glass, cracked but still intact. The land stretched out before her, silver in the moonlight, beautiful in its own harsh way. She'd loved it once, when she'd first come here with her husband, when they'd been young and stupid and full of dreams about building something from nothing, about carving out a life in this wild, empty place. Those dreams were dead now, buried deeper than her husband's body, rotting in ground too hard to break. Mara pressed her forehead against the warm glass and finally let herself cry. Quietly, so the children wouldn't hear. The tears came hot and fast, running down her cheeks, dripping off her chin. She cried for her husband, for the future they'd never have, for the children she couldn't feed, for the person she'd been before grief and poverty had worn her down to nothing. And she cried because a stranger had offered her kindness, and she had no idea how to accept it without feeling like she was giving up, admitting defeat, confirming every terrible thing she already believed about herself. Behind her, someone stirred. Small footsteps on the creaking floor. "Mama?" Thomas. Of course it was Thomas. He'd always been the one who noticed, who felt things too deeply, who carried weights no 10-year-old should have to carry. Mara wiped her eyes quickly and turned. "Go back to sleep, baby." "You're crying." "I'm fine." "You say that a lot." He crossed his arms, a gesture so heartbreakingly adult it made her chest hurt. "But you're not fine. None of us are." Mara opened her mouth to protest, to offer another lie, but she couldn't. Not to him. Not anymore. "No," she admitted softly. "We're not." Thomas moved closer, and in the moonlight she could see how much he looked like his father. Same dark hair, same serious expression, same way of holding himself like he was bracing for a blow. "Are we going to go with him? That man?" I think so. Yes." "Do you trust him?" It was the question she'd been asking herself all night, and the truth was, she didn't know. Trust had to be earned, and Caleb Rourke was a stranger, but maybe that was exactly why she could trust him, because he had nothing to gain from helping her, no history to complicate things, no expectations beyond basic human decency. "I don't have much choice," Mara said finally. Thomas thought about this. Pa used to say sometimes the brave thing ain't fighting, sometimes it's knowing when to accept help. Fresh tears spilled down Mara's cheeks. "Your father was a good man." "He was." Thomas's voice cracked. "I miss him." "Me too, baby. Me too." They stood together in the darkness, mother and son, holding the shape of their grief between them. Outside, a coyote howled, lonely, mournful, achingly familiar. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in a place she'd never seen, a man named Caleb Rourke slept under the same stars, dreaming of a woman and 6 children he'd decided, for reasons she couldn't fathom, to save. Tomorrow would come. It always did. And with it, a chance, fragile and uncertain, to begin again. Dawn came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Mara had finally fallen asleep sometime around 3 in the morning, curled around her children like a shield, and when she woke, the sun was already climbing, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if she'd had the luxury of noticing. Instead, she jolted upright with her heart racing, instantly calculating how much time she had before Caleb arrived. Not enough. Never enough. She moved through the house like a woman possessed, gathering what little they owned with hands that shook from exhaustion and nerves. The children woke one by one, confused and frightened by her urgency, and she tried to explain without really explaining, her words tumbling over each other in a rush that probably made no sense. "We're leaving," she said, shoving a battered tin cup into a cloth sack. "Just for a while. Just until..." Until what? Until the drought broke? Until she could magically resurrect her dead husband and restore their broken life? Until some miracle occurred that would make staying here anything other than a slow death sentence? Until things get better, she finished lamely. Thomas watched her with those 2 old eyes. "We're going with the man, the one from yesterday." It wasn't a question, but Mara nodded anyway. "His name is Caleb. He has a place, a cabin, with a roof and a well, and he's a stranger," Thomas said quietly. "Yes. But we're going anyway." "Yes." Thomas considered this, then started rolling up his bedroll without another word. The other children followed his lead, moving with the resigned efficiency of people who'd learned not to question, not to hope too hard, not to expect anything beyond the next hour. Mara's heart broke a little more, which she hadn't thought was possible. How much breaking could one heart endure before it simply stopped working altogether? She was stuffing her husband's Bible into the sack, one of the few things she was determined to keep, even though she hadn't opened it since he died, when she heard it. The sound of wagon wheels crunching over dry earth, the soft jingle of harness, the steady clip-clop of hooves. He'd come. Caleb Rourke had actually come. For some reason, she'd half expected him not to. Expected yesterday to have been some kind of heat-induced hallucination, or for him to have come to his senses overnight and realized that taking in a widow and 6 starving children was the kind of charity that would bleed a man dry. But there he was, cresting the ridge just as the sun cleared the horizon, his wagon trailing dust like a banner. Mara stepped out onto the sagging porch, the baby, awake now and mercifully quiet, balanced on her hip. The other children crowded behind her, peering around her skirts, curious and afraid in equal measure. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in what used to be the yard. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than she had yesterday. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 40, maybe more, with deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. His face was weathered dark by sun and wind, and there was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow that gave him a permanently questioning expression. He wore the same dusty clothes as yesterday, but his hat was pulled back now, and she could see dark hair streaked with gray. Not a handsome man exactly, but solid, real, present. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Morning," Mara replied. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, formal, distant, like she was play-acting at being someone who had conversations with men who offered to save her. Caleb's eyes swept over the children, counting, assessing. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened. "These all yours?" "Yes." "Good-looking kids." Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The children stared at him with varying degrees of suspicion and hope, and Caleb looked back steadily, not trying to smile or win them over, just acknowledging them, seeing them. After a moment, he climbed down from the wagon and walked around to the back, dropping the tailgate. "I lined the bed with straw," he said. "Should make the ride easier. It's about 4 hours to my place, maybe 5 with the wait." 4 hours, Mara repeated. Somehow she'd imagined his cabin being closer. 4 hours meant commitment. 4 hours meant there'd be no easy way back if this turned out to be a mistake. Give or take. Caleb studied her face, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he could read every doubt, every fear, every desperate calculation running through her mind. "You having second thoughts?" I'm having about 15 thoughts, she admitted, before she could stop herself. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. That's fair. I don't even know you. No, ma'am, you don't. You could be. She stopped, glancing at the children, not wanting to say it in front of them. Could be all sorts of things, Caleb finished quietly. Could be a liar, or a thief, or worse. All you got is my word, and I know that ain't much. But I'm here, and I'm offering, and you gotta decide if taking the risk is better than staying. It was the same calculation she'd been running all night, laid bare in the stark morning light. Stay and starve, or go and risk what? Everything? Nothing? She didn't even know anymore. Thomas stepped forward. What's your cabin like? Caleb looked down at him, and something passed between them, some kind of male understanding that Mara couldn't quite read. Small, he said honestly. 2 rooms. Needs work. But it's dry and the stove works, and there's game in the hills if you know how to shoot. I know how to shoot, Thomas said. My pa taught me. That's good, real good. Caleb crouched down so he was eye level with the boy. You're the oldest? Yes, sir. Then you're the man of the family now. That's a heavy load. Thomas's jaw tightened. I can carry it. I believe you can, but maybe you don't have to carry it alone. The words hung in the air, and Mara saw something shift in her son's face. The rigid control cracked just slightly, and for a moment he looked like what he was, a 10-year-old boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, too hard, with no time for grief or fear or weakness. Okay, Thomas said softly. Caleb nodded and stood up, looking back at Mara. Your call. Mara took a deep breath. The morning air was already warming, already carrying the promise of another brutal day. Behind her, the house leaned and creaked. Behind the smokehouse, her husband waited in his canvas shroud. And all around them, the land stretched out, empty, unforgiving, already claiming back what little they'd tried to build. All right, she said, give us 10 minutes. Take what you need. In the end, they filled 2 cloth sacks and a battered trunk that had belonged to Mara's mother, quilts, clothes, a few tin dishes and cups, her husband's Bible and his watch, which had stopped working but which she couldn't bear to leave behind. A rag doll that had been Sarah's before hunger made play seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. Joseph's stick, worn smooth from constant handling. The twins shared boots, 1 pair between them, traded off depending on who needed to walk that day. It wasn't much. A whole life reduced to objects that could fit in a wagon bed. Mara made one final trip inside, moving through rooms that had held all her hopes, and watched them die. The bedroom where she'd given birth to 3 of her children. The kitchen where she'd cooked meals back when they'd had meals to cook. The front room where her husband used to sit in the evening reading by lamplight, his voice a low rumble as he shared passages from books they couldn't afford, but he'd borrowed from neighbors. All of it was ending. Had already ended, really. She was just finally admitting it. She walked out without looking back, because looking back would undo her completely. Caleb had already loaded the trunk and helped the children into the wagon bed. They sat in a row, small and solemn, watching her with eyes that held too much understanding. Mara climbed up beside them, settling the baby in her lap, and Caleb closed the tailgate. One more thing, he said. He walked around the side of the house, and Mara's heart seized. The smokehouse. Her husband. Oh God, she'd forgotten. Caleb reappeared a moment later, carrying a shovel. He moved to a spot about 20 yards from the house, in the shadow of the cottonwood tree, and started digging. Mara watched, frozen, as he worked. The ground was hard. She knew exactly how hard. But Caleb attacked it with a patient, methodical rhythm that spoke of experience and strength. He didn't rush, didn't stop, just kept digging, the shovel biting into earth that grudgingly gave way inch by stubborn inch. Mama? Lily whispered. What's he doing? Making a grave, Thomas answered before Mara could. An hour passed. Then another. The sun climbed higher and Caleb's shirt grew dark with sweat, but he didn't pause except to occasionally stop and drink from a canteen. The hole grew deeper, wider, taking shape. Mara sat in the wagon and watched a stranger dig her husband's grave, and the kindness of it was almost worse than anything else. It meant she owed him, It meant she was accepting not just shelter, but something far more profound. The acknowledgement that she couldn't do this alone, that she'd failed, that she needed saving. When the hole was finally deep enough, Caleb climbed out and looked at her. His face was flushed, his breathing heavy, but his eyes were steady. "You want to say anything?" Did she? What was there to say? The words she'd wanted to speak at a proper funeral, the ones about love and loss until death do us part, felt hollow now. Her husband was gone. She was leaving. Life continued with a brutality that made poetry seem obscene. "No," she said quietly. "Just put him in." Caleb nodded and walked behind the smokehouse. He returned carrying the canvas-wrapped body with surprising gentleness, cradling it like something precious rather than something dead. He lowered it into the grave with care, then straightened and removed his hat, pressing it to his chest. "Don't know what you believed," he said, speaking to the grave, to the dead man who couldn't hear him, to the watching sky. "But I hope you're somewhere peaceful, and I hope you know your family's going to be all right. I'll see to it." It was a promise made to a corpse, and it shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow it did. Somehow it meant everything. Caleb replaced his hat and started filling in the grave. The children watched in silence, and Mara held the baby close, pressing her face against his soft hair so no one would see her cry. When it was done, when the earth was mounded over her husband's body and marked with a simple wooden cross Caleb fashioned from 2 pieces of broken fence, they finally left. The wagon rolled forward, wheels creaking, and Mara didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the grave, not at any of it. She kept her eyes forward, on the horizon, on whatever came next. They rode in silence for the first hour. The only sounds, the creak of the wagon, the clip-clop of hooves, and the endless whisper of wind across the plains. The children dozed in the straw, exhausted by emotion and heat. Mara sat rigid, the baby heavy in her arms, her mind carefully blank. "You ever been this far west?" Caleb asked eventually. Mara blinked, pulled from whatever dark place she'd retreated to. "No. We settled where we did because there was a creek, or there used to be. Drought killed a lot of creeks. Killed a lot of things." Caleb glanced at her, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Your husband, how long's he been gone?" 6 weeks. Give or take?" She paused. "Fever took him. Fast. 3 days from first symptom to—" She couldn't finish. Didn't need to. "I'm sorry." Everyone's sorry. It came out harsher than she'd intended. But sorry doesn't plant crops or feed children or dig graves in ground that's hard as iron. "No," Caleb agreed quietly. "It don't." They fell silent again. Mara watched the landscape change subtly as they traveled, the plains giving way to gentle rises, the occasional cluster of rocks, a dried-up wash that might have been a river once. It was still brutally hot, but there was something different about the air here, less dusty, almost fresher. "You got water where we're going?" she asked. "Spring-fed well, never run dry, even in bad years. One of the reasons I settled where I did." "You alone?" "Yeah." "Why?" Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Had a wife once, and a little girl. Cholera took 'em both back in '84. After that, I couldn't stay where we'd been. Too many ghosts. So I came out here and built something new." Mara absorbed this, understanding blooming slowly. "That's why you helped us." "Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being alone. 6 kids ain't alone. 6 kids is chaos." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Fair point. You know what you're getting into?" "Not even a little bit," he admitted, "but I figure we'll sort it out as we go." It was such a breathtakingly honest answer that Mara found herself almost smiling. Almost. "They're loud," she warned. "When they're not starving and scared, they're loud. They fight and cry and make messes and break things." Sounds about right for kids. "And I don't know how long we'll need to stay. Could be weeks, could be months. I gotta figure out what comes next, and that might take time." "Take what time you need." "I can work," she added quickly. "I'm strong when I'm fed proper. I can cook and clean and mend and—" "Mara," Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "You don't gotta earn your keep. You and yours need help, and I got the means to give it. That's the beginning and end of it. Nothing's free. This is. Why? The question burst out of her, raw and desperate. Why would you do this? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. So why, Because I can, Caleb said simply. And because if I don't, who will? The answer hung between them, true and terrible and completely without artifice. And Mara realized, with a jolt that felt like falling, that he meant it. Every word. This strange, scarred man with his quiet voice and his dead family and his spring-fed well, he genuinely wanted to help, with no expectation of payment or gratitude or anything beyond basic human decency. It was the most radical thing she'd ever encountered. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what he was offering, but they were all she had. Caleb just nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "You're welcome." They reached the cabin in late afternoon when the sun was still high, but beginning its slow descent toward evening. Mara saw it from a distance, a small structure of weathered wood nestled in a shallow valley, with a stand of pine trees behind it and what looked like a vegetable garden to one side. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, and there were chickens scratching in the yard. It looked lived in, cared for, real. "This is it," Caleb said, steering the wagon down a rutted path. The children stirred, sitting up and peering over the sides of the wagon, their faces tight with uncertainty. Thomas met Mara's eyes, and she tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "It's going to be okay," her expression said. "We're safe now." More lies. Beautiful, necessary lies. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin, and Mara climbed down on shaking legs. The baby fussed in her arms, hungry and tired, and she bounced him automatically while taking in her surroundings. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, still small, but solidly built with real glass in the windows and a porch that didn't sag. The garden held rows of struggling vegetables, beans and squash and something that might have been tomatoes, all suffering from the heat but still alive. The well stood to one side, its bucket hung on a hook, and beyond it she could see a small barn and what looked like a chicken coop. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely more than what she'd left behind. 2 rooms, Caleb said, climbing down and starting to unhitch the horses. Main room with the stove and table, and a bedroom off the back. I've been sleeping in the main room, so the bedroom's yours. All of you. Where will you sleep? Barn's fine. We can't take your bed. You ain't taking it. I'm offering it. He glanced at her, his expression firm. You got 6 kids and yourself to fit somewhere. I got just me. Barn makes more sense. Mara wanted to argue, but she was too tired, and he was right. Just for a few days, she said, until we figure something else out. However long you need. He finished with the horses and started unloading the wagon, carrying their meager possessions inside with an efficiency that suggested he'd spent his life doing physical labor. The children climbed out slowly, cautiously, sticking close to Mara as they explored this strange new place. The inside of the cabin was dim and cool after the brightness outside. The main room held a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 4 mismatched chairs, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, holding dishes and supplies. A rifle hung over the mantel. The floor was clean-swept wood, and there was a rag rug near the stove that looked hand-braided. "Bedroom's through here," Caleb said, pushing open a door. The room beyond was small but adequate. A real bed with a rope frame and a mattress, a trunk at the foot, hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. One window looked out toward the pine trees. It smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco, and something else she couldn't quite place, something masculine and unfamiliar but not unpleasant. "It's..." Mara's voice caught. "It's nice." "It's simple," Caleb corrected, "but it's dry and it's safe." Safe. That word again. She was starting to believe it might be true. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of settling in. Caleb showed Thomas how to work the pump on the well, and the boy filled bucket after bucket of clear, cold water, more water than they'd seen in months. The children drank until their bellies sloshed, then drank more, unable to believe there was enough. Mara nursed the baby in the bedroom, grateful for privacy and the relative coolness. And when she emerged, Caleb had somehow produced bread and cheese and apples, real food, not just the thin cornmeal mush they'd been surviving on. Eat, he said simply, and they did. The children fell on the food with a desperation that was painful to watch, stuffing their mouths, barely chewing, their bodies remembering hunger even as they tried to satisfy it. Mara forced herself to eat slowly, to model control, even though she wanted to weep at the taste of real bread, real cheese, real anything. Easy, Caleb warned gently. You eat too fast after starving, you'll just sick it back up. He was right. Samuel ate too quickly and had to run outside to vomit, and after that, the others slowed down, their bodies learning to trust that there would be more, that this wasn't the last meal they'd ever get. After dinner, as the sun finally began to sink and the heat started to break, Caleb showed them around the property, the garden, where he pointed out which plants needed watering and which were beyond saving. The chicken coop, where 5 hens clucked and scratched. The barn, which held 2 horses, a milk cow, and enough hay to last through winter. I ain't rich, he said, but I got enough, and now we're sharing it. We. The word settled over Mara like a blanket. Strange, uncomfortable, impossibly comforting. That night, they all slept in the bedroom, Mara and the 3 youngest on the bed, the older children on quilts spread on the floor. It was crowded and warm, but it was safe, and for the first time in 6 weeks, Mara allowed herself to relax, to let her guard down, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. She woke once in the deep night to hear movement outside, soft footsteps, the creak of the barn door. Caleb, settling in for his own sleep, exiled from his own home by his own choice. She thought about calling out to him, about inviting him to sleep on the floor in the main room at least. But something stopped her. He'd offered them privacy, dignity, space to breathe. The least she could do was accept it gracefully. Besides, she barely knew him. And trust, no matter how desperately needed, couldn't be manufactured overnight. So she closed her eyes and listened to her children breathe, slow, steady, peaceful, and let sleep take her back down into darkness. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own questions, its own uncertainties. But tonight, they were safe, and that would have to be enough. The morning broke gentle and cool, a mercy after so many brutal dawns. Mara woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been stretching for months. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was, and panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. Then she felt the solid mattress beneath her, heard her children's breathing, saw sunlight filtering through clean glass, and remembered. Caleb's cabin. Safety. A reprieve from the slow death they'd been living. She extracted herself carefully from the tangle of sleeping children and padded barefoot into the main room. Caleb stood at the stove, his back to her, coaxing life from the fire. He'd already been outside. His boots were dusty, and there was straw clinging to his shirt. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready." "You didn't have to—" "I know." He glanced over his shoulder, and in the early light she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He hadn't slept well either. "But I did anyway." Mara moved to the table and sat, suddenly aware of how she must look, hair tangled, dress wrinkled, still wearing the exhaustion of the previous day like a second skin. But Caleb didn't seem to notice or care. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to her, the steam rising in lazy spirals. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the cup. The warmth felt like prayer. "You're welcome." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, drinking coffee and listening to the morning sounds filtering through the open window. Birds. A breeze moving through the pines. The distant lowing of the cow. Peaceful sounds. Safe sounds. "I've been thinking," Caleb said eventually, "about how we make this work." Mara tensed. Here it came. The conditions, the expectations, the price of his charity. "All right. The garden needs tending, and I could use help with the chickens and the cow. Thomas seems like he could learn to handle the horses. Maybe help with repairs around the place. The little ones can gather eggs, fetch water, simple things." He paused. "But that's just me thinking out loud. You got your own ideas about what you and yours can handle. I'd like to hear them." It took Mara a moment to understand what he was offering. Not orders, but collaboration. Not demands, but suggestions. He was including her in decisions about their own lives, treating her like a partner rather than a burden. That sounds reasonable, she managed. I'm good with a needle. I could mend clothes, make new ones if you got fabric, and I can cook if you got food to cook with. Got plenty. Caleb sipped his coffee. Had to learn to preserve things when I was alone. Root cellars full of what I put up last fall. Potatoes, carrots, onions, some dried meat, flour and cornmeal and such. We won't starve. The words should have been reassuring, but instead they made Mara's throat tight. Why are you doing this? She asked again, because she still couldn't understand it, couldn't make it make sense. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. You ever see someone drowning? What? Drowning. In a river or a lake. You ever seen it? Mara shook her head, confused. I did once. Little girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, fell off a dock while her mama was buying supplies. Water was moving fast and she couldn't swim. He stared into his coffee. I was maybe 20 feet away, and I had a choice, jump in and help or keep walking. Weren't my kid, weren't my problem, could have just kept walking. But you didn't. No, ma'am, I didn't. He looked up at her. Because that's not the kind of man I wanted to be. And this, he gestured around the cabin, encompassing everything. This ain't different. You were drowning. I could help, so I did. It was the simplest, most honest answer she'd ever heard, and it undid something in her chest. She blinked hard against tears that wanted to come, and nodded, not trusting her voice. The children began stirring then, filtering into the main room one by one, rubbing sleep from their eyes and staring at Caleb with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. He greeted each one calmly, learning their names, asking gentle questions that they answered in monosyllables or not at all. Breakfast was simple. Cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, milk fresh from the cow. But it was abundant, and no one had to fight for seconds. Mara watched her children eat, watched color slowly returning to their faces, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Something that whispered maybe. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Caleb would wake before dawn and tend to the animals, then wake the household with coffee and whatever breakfast he'd managed to cobble together. After eating, they'd divide up the work, Thomas helping Caleb with the heavier tasks, the girls working in the garden or tending chickens, the younger boys doing whatever simple chores their small hands could manage. Mara cooked and cleaned and mended, falling into domestic routines that felt both familiar and strange. It was the same work she'd always done, but without the constant terror of scarcity, without the gnawing hunger that had made every task feel impossible. With enough food and water and rest, she felt her strength returning slowly, her body remembering what it felt like to be functional rather than merely surviving. Caleb was unfailingly patient with the children. When Samuel broke a bowl, he simply swept it up without comment. When Lily cried because she missed her father, he handed her a handkerchief and sat nearby in respectful silence. When Joseph got kicked by one of the chickens and wailed like he'd been mortally wounded, Caleb examined the small bruise with great seriousness and declared the boy tough as leather. And slowly, tentatively, the children began to relax, to play, to be children again instead of hollow-eyed ghosts going through the motions of living. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The brutal summer heat continued, but here in the valley with the spring-fed well and the shade of the pines, it felt bearable. Mara watched her children transform, gaining weight, growing louder, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny just because they could. Thomas smiled for the first time in months. The twins invented elaborate games with sticks and stones. Even the baby seemed happier, his cries less desperate, more the normal fussing of a healthy child. And Mara began to breathe. She was hanging laundry one morning, real laundry, washed in abundant water and dried in clean sun, when she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats approaching fast, urgent. Her hands stilled on the clothesline, and she turned to see a rider cresting the hill, a young man on a dark horse, moving with the kind of speed that meant trouble. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants, his expression alert. "That's Dale Haskins," he said quietly. "Deputy from town." Mara's stomach clenched. "What does he want?" "Don't know, but we're about to find out." The deputy pulled up in front of the cabin, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He was young, maybe 22 or 23, with a baby face that made him look like he was playing dress-up in his badge and gun belt. But his expression was serious, almost frightened. "Mr. Rourke," he said, touching his hat. "Ma'am." "Deputy." Caleb's voice was neutral. "Something wrong?" Dale dismounted, glancing around nervously. "I got word I needed to deliver. Wasn't sure I should, but the sheriff said it's my job to carry messages, pleasant or not." "What message?" The deputy pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Man named Silas Ward filed a claim in the county seat. Says he's got a legal right to take custody of 6 children currently residing with one Mara Fielding." The world tilted. Mara's hands went numb, and the wet shirt she'd been holding fell back into the basket. "What?" "Says you're his sister," Dale continued, looking at Mara with something like pity. "Says you're unfit to care for the children due to, well, it says destitution and moral turpitude, whatever that means. Judge issued a writ allowing him to come claim them." "No." The word came out strangled. "No, he can't." "Who is this man?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "My brother," Mara whispered. Her legs felt weak, and she reached out to grip the clothesline for support. "My older brother. We haven't spoken in years." "Why?" "Because Silas was cruel. Because he disapproved of her marriage to a poor farmer with no prospects. Because he'd told her she was making a mistake, throwing her life away, and when she'd done it anyway, he'd cut her off completely. Because he'd never met her children, never sent a letter, never acknowledged their existence until now, when they might be useful to him." "We had a falling out," she said. "When I married." Dale shifted uncomfortably. "He's coming from back east, Pennsylvania, I think. Said he'll be here within the week to collect the children and take them back with him." "Like hell he will." Caleb's voice cut through the air like a blade. The deputy took a step back. "Sir, I'm just delivering the message. I don't make the laws." "The law says a stranger can just take children from their mother?" "It says family has rights, especially when there's questions about the mother's ability to provide proper care." Dale looked genuinely distressed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I truly am. But if he's got the paperwork and a judge's order, then what?" Mara heard herself say. Her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. "I just hand them over? Let him take them away to some place they've never been, to live with a man they've never met?" "I don't know, ma'am. I'm just telling you what's coming." Caleb moved to stand beside Mara, his presence solid and grounding. "How long we got?" "He sent the telegram 4 days ago. If he left right away and the trains are running on time, could be here by end of week. Maybe sooner." 4 days? Maybe less. 4 days before her brother arrived with his legal papers and his Eastern money and his absolute certainty that he knew what was best. 4 days before everything she'd fought to protect was ripped away. "Thank you for the warning, Deputy," Caleb said. His hand found Mara's elbow, steadying her. "We appreciate you riding out." Dale nodded, clearly eager to leave. He mounted his horse and rode off, and Mara watched him go with a strange detachment, like she was observing her own life from a great distance. "Mara." Caleb's voice was gentle. "Look at me." She did. His eyes were steady, determined, and in them she saw something that made her chest ache, resolve. He wasn't going to let this happen. Somehow, impossibly, this man she'd known for less than a month was prepared to fight for children who weren't his, for a woman who had no claim on him, for a family that existed only by accident and necessity. "We'll figure this out," he said. "How?" "He's got the law on his side." "Then we'll find another side." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Tell me about him. Your brother. What kind of man is he?" Mara's mind raced backward through years of memory. Silas had been the golden child, educated, successful, everything their parents had hoped for. And she'd been the disappointment, the one who'd chosen love over security, passion over prudence. When she'd married against their wishes, Silas had washed his hands of her with the cold finality of a man closing a ledger book. "He's a lawyer," she said. "Successful, connected. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife. No children of their own, last I heard. He's proper, respectable. Everything I'm not." Why now? Why come for them now? It was the question she'd been asking herself. "I don't know." Maybe he heard about my husband dying. Maybe someone back east told him we were destitute. Or maybe, her voice caught, maybe he's always wanted children and couldn't have them, and this is his chance. Would he be good to them? Mara wanted to lie, wanted to paint her brother as a monster so the choice would be clear. But honesty demanded more. Probably. In his way. He'd feed them and clothe them and educate them, give them opportunities they'll never have here. She looked at Caleb, her eyes burning. But he'd make them into something they're not, mold them into proper Eastern society children, take away everything wild and free about them. Is that what you want? Of course not. The words burst out, raw and desperate. They're my children, mine. I carried them, birthed them, kept them alive through drought and death, and things no child should have to endure. Silas has no right. She broke off, because the law said he did have a right. The law said a destitute widow was unfit, and a wealthy lawyer was preferable. The law didn't care about love or sacrifice or the invisible bonds that held a family together. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the cabin, his young face tight with fear. He'd clearly heard everything. Mama? Mara turned to him, and seeing the terror in his eyes made something fierce and terrible rise up in her chest. Come here, baby. He crossed the distance quickly and pressed himself against her side, and she wrapped her arm around his thin shoulders. Behind him, the other children emerged one by one, drawn by the sense that something was wrong, that the fragile safety they'd built was crumbling. What's happening? Sarah asked. Is someone taking us away? Samuel's voice trembled. Mara opened her mouth but couldn't form words. What could she say? That yes, a stranger with legal authority was coming to tear them apart? That all her fighting and surviving and struggling had been for nothing? Caleb crouched down so he was eye level with the children. Listen to me, he said quietly. All of you. Someone is coming who wants to take you away from your mama. A man who thinks he knows what's best for you. But he don't know you. He don't know what you've been through, or how strong you are, or how much you belong together. We don't want to go, Lily whispered. I know, and we ain't going to let it happen if we can help it. How? Thomas's voice was sharp, angry. You said he's got the law. How do you fight the law? It was a good question, maybe the only question that mattered. Caleb stood, his hand resting on Thomas's shoulder. Sometimes you can't fight it head on. Sometimes you got to get creative. What does that mean? It means... Caleb stopped, his eyes moving to Mara, and something passed between them. An idea. Impossible. Ridiculous. But maybe... What? Mara asked. The law says a destitute widow is unfit. But what if you ain't destitute no more? What if you got means to provide for them? I don't have anything. You know that. But I do. Caleb's expression was intensely serious. And if we were married, what's mine would be yours. You wouldn't be destitute. You'd be the wife of a property owner with resources, the mother in a two-parent household. The words hung in the air, impossible and enormous. Marriage. To a man she barely knew, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with legal maneuvering. You can't, Mara started. I can, if you're willing. That's insane. Maybe, but it's also practical. Caleb looked at the children, then back at her. I already made a promise to your husband that I'd see you all right. This is just making it official. Caleb, you don't understand what you're offering. Marriage isn't just a piece of paper. It's... I know what it is. His voice was firm. And I'm offering anyway. Not because I expect anything from you, but because it's the only way I can think of to keep these children with their mother where they belong. Thomas was staring at Caleb with something like wonder. You'd do that? You'd marry Mama just to help us. I would. But you don't even... Sarah stopped, confused. You don't love her. No, Caleb agreed quietly. I don't. Not the way your pa did. But I care about what happens to all of you, and I believe in keeping families together when I can. Mara felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, wind whipping around her, trying to decide whether to jump or step back. Marriage to Caleb would solve the immediate problem, give her legal protection, financial stability, the appearance of propriety, but it would also bind her to a man she hardly knew, create obligations and expectations she couldn't predict. And yet, what choice did she have? Let Silas take her children? Watch them disappear into a life of Eastern refinement and propriety, forever changed into people she wouldn't recognize? I need to think, she said. Fair enough, but we ain't got much time. That night, after the children were asleep, Mara sat on the porch steps and stared at the stars. They looked different here than they had at her old homestead, brighter somehow, closer, like she could reach up and touch them. Behind her, through the open window, she could hear Caleb moving around in the main room, banking the fire, preparing for bed in the barn. He'd given her space all evening, hadn't pressed or argued or tried to convince her, just stated his offer and left her to decide, as if proposing a marriage of convenience was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe for him it was. He'd already lost the love of his life. Maybe this kind of practical arrangement was all he wanted. Companionship without vulnerability, partnership without passion. But what did she want? Mara closed her eyes and tried to imagine it, living here permanently, raising her children with Caleb as their stepfather, sharing a life built on gratitude and necessity rather than love. It seemed hollow somehow, a pale imitation of what she'd had with her husband. But her husband was dead, and her children were alive, and keeping them alive, keeping them safe, keeping them hers, that had to matter more than her own comfort or pride or romantic notions of what marriage should be. You still awake? She turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, barefoot and squinting in the darkness. Can't sleep, she admitted. He came and sat beside her, his small shoulder pressing against hers. You thinking about what Mr. Rourke said? Yes? Are you going to marry him? I don't know, baby. It's complicated. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring at the same stars she'd been watching. Pa would want you to, he said finally. Mara's breath caught. What? Pa. He'd want you to do whatever it took to keep us together. He used to say family was everything, that you fight for family no matter what. He did say that, Mara whispered. And Mr. Rourke's a good man. He dug Pa's grave, and he feeds us, and he don't yell or hit or nothing. He's kind. Thomas looked at her, his young face heartbreakingly earnest. I think Pa would approve. The tears came then, hot and fast, and Mara didn't try to stop them. She pulled Thomas close and cried into his hair while he held her with a strength no 10-year-old should have to possess. And in that moment, her decision crystallized. Not because she wanted to marry Caleb Rourke, but because her son was right. Family was everything, and she would fight for them, would sacrifice anything, even her own wishes, to keep them safe. When Silas Ward arrived 3 days later, he came in a hired carriage pulled by matched bay horses, wearing a black wool suit that must have been sweltering in the Dakota heat. He was older than Mara remembered, nearly 50 now, with gray threading through his dark hair and jowls that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, absolutely certain of his own righteousness. Mara stood on the porch with Caleb beside her and watched her brother climb down from the carriage with the careful movements of a man unused to physical labor. The children were inside, hidden, safe for the moment. Mara. Silas's voice was clipped, Eastern, every syllable precisely formed. You look unwell. Hello, Silas. His eyes moved to Caleb, assessing, dismissing. And who is this? Another of your poor choices? This, Mara said, lifting her chin, is my husband, Caleb Rourke. Silas's eyebrows rose. Husband? I was informed you were widowed. I was. I'm not anymore. Mara reached for Caleb's hand, and he took it without hesitation, his grip warm and solid. We were married 2 days ago. It was true. They'd ridden into town, found a minister willing to perform a quick ceremony, and spoken vows that felt both weightless and heavy as stone. No romance, no celebration, just signatures on paper that transformed their legal reality. Silas's expression hardened. How convenient, and how sudden. We've been living together for over a month, Caleb said evenly. Seemed like time to make it proper. Living together. Silas's voice dripped with disdain. Yes, I'm sure that was very proper indeed. Watch yourself, Caleb said quietly, but there was steel underneath. That's my wife you're insulting. Your wife. Silas pulled a sheaf of papers from his jacket. I have documents here granting me custody of 6 minor children on the grounds of their mother's inability to provide adequate care. Documents signed by a judge and legally binding. Those documents are based on false information, Mara said. I'm not destitute. I have a home, resources, a husband who provides for us. A husband you acquired very recently and very conveniently, just days before my arrival. Silas's smile was thin. Any judge will see through this obvious ploy. Then we'll find a judge who values keeping children with their mother over shipping them off to a stranger. Caleb stepped forward. You never met these kids. Never sent a letter or a dollar or a single word of support while they were starving. And now you want to swoop in and play savior? I want to provide them with proper education, proper opportunities, proper upbringing, things my sister clearly cannot offer. Silas looked at Mara. Look at you, living in this hovel, married to some frontier farmer. Is this really what you want for your children? I want them with me, Mara said. I want them safe and loved and free, not molded into something they're not to satisfy your ego. My ego? Silas laughed, bitter and cold. This isn't about ego. This is about doing what's right. Those children deserve better than poverty and ignorance. They deserve their mother. A mother who can't even provide basic necessities. I can now, Mara said. We can. Caleb and I together, we can give them everything they need. Silas studied them both, his expression calculating. Then he nodded slowly. We'll see what the court says. I've already filed my claim. The judge will review your marriage and make a determination. When? Caleb asked. 2 weeks. There's a circuit judge coming through. He'll hear the case. Silas climbed back into his carriage. I'm staying at the hotel in town. I'll be watching, and if I see any evidence of neglect or impropriety, I'll use it. He rode away in a cloud of dust and self-satisfaction, and Mara sagged against Caleb, her legs suddenly weak. We have 2 weeks, Caleb said quietly. To do what? To prove we're a real family. To show the judge that those children belong here with us. He turned to face her. Can you do that? Mara looked at this man who'd become her husband for purely practical reasons, who'd sacrificed his solitude and his peace to help a stranger, who was now willing to fight the law itself to keep children who weren't his blood. Yes, she said, we can do that. And for the first time since the deputy had brought his terrible news, she felt something other than fear. Not confidence exactly, but determination. Silas had money and education and legal documents. But she had something more powerful. She had love and sacrifice, and a partner who'd proven he'd stand beside her no matter what came. It would have to be enough. The 2 weeks that followed felt like living under siege. Every day, Mara woke with the knowledge that somewhere in town, Silas was watching, waiting, gathering ammunition for the court hearing that would determine her children's fate. The weight of it pressed down on everything, every meal, every chore, every moment of laughter that felt too brief, too fragile, like something that could shatter at the slightest touch. But if Caleb felt the pressure, he didn't show it. He moved through those days with the same steady patience he'd shown from the beginning, working the land, tending the animals, teaching Thomas how to mend fence posts, and showing the twins how to identify which plants in the garden were ready for harvest. He treated the children with a quiet kindness that never felt forced or performative, and slowly, tentatively, they began to call him something other than Mr. Rourke. It started with Joseph, who was too young to remember his father clearly, and saw in Caleb simply a man who was present and kind. Papa Caleb, he said one morning, tugging on the man's sleeve to show him a beetle he'd found, and Mara's heart had seized in her chest. Caleb had looked at her then, a question in his eyes, and she'd nodded. Because what else could she do? Her children needed a father, and this man, this stranger who'd become her husband, was willing to be that for them. Who was she to deny them that comfort, that security, just because it felt like a betrayal of the man who should have been here? The days developed a rhythm that felt almost normal. Caleb would wake before dawn and tend to the morning chores while Mara prepared breakfast. They'd eat together at the rough-hewn table, all 8 of them crowded around it, passing plates and cups in a choreographed dance that was becoming familiar. After breakfast, the work would divide. Caleb and Thomas to the heavier outdoor tasks, Mara and the girls to the garden and the cooking and the endless mending, the younger boys to whatever simple jobs their small hands could manage. In the afternoons, when the heat grew oppressive, they'd rest in the shade of the pines. Caleb would whittle, creating small toys for the children. A horse for Joseph, a doll for Lily, a whistle for Samuel. Mara would sew, her needle moving through fabric with practiced precision, creating new clothes from old ones, patching what could be patched, making their meager resources stretch as far as possible. And in the evenings, after the children were asleep, Mara and Caleb would sit on the porch and talk. Not about the hearing or Silas or the fear that lived in both their chests. Instead, they talked about small things, the best way to preserve vegetables for winter, whether they should try planting corn next spring, stories from their past that felt safe enough to share. Mara learned that Caleb had fought in the Indian Wars, that he'd seen things that still haunted his sleep, that he'd loved his first wife with a devotion that bordered on worship, and her death had nearly destroyed him. That he'd come west not to build something but to escape something, and only slowly had this land become home rather than exile. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about parents who'd wanted better for her than a farmer's wife in the territories, about falling in love with a man who'd promised her adventure and delivered hardship, and how she'd never regretted it because he'd given her children who made every struggle worthwhile, about the slow erosion of hope as drought and poverty ground them down, and the terrible guilt of being relieved when death had taken her husband because at least his suffering was over. "That's a hard thing to carry," Caleb said quietly when she admitted this. "All of it's hard," Mara replied. "But I'd carry it again if I could have him back." "I know." Caleb was silent for a moment, staring out at the darkness. "But he's not coming back, and you got to figure out how to live with that. Is that what you did, after your wife?" "Eventually. Took a long time, though. Years where I wasn't really living, just existing, going through motions because stopping meant facing what I'd lost." He glanced at her. "You got an advantage I didn't have." "What's that?" "Them." He nodded toward the cabin where their children slept. "You got reasons to keep going that got nothing to do with yourself. That makes it easier, I think, or at least more necessary." He was right. Her children had pulled her through when she'd wanted to give up, had given her purpose when everything else felt meaningless. They were her anchor, her reason, her everything, and now Silas wanted to take them away. On the 5th day, Mara was hanging laundry when she saw a figure approaching on foot from the direction of town. A woman, moving slowly in the heat, her dress dark and proper despite the temperature. As she got closer, Mara recognized her, Martha Brennan, the minister's wife, who'd witnessed their hasty wedding ceremony. "Mrs. Rourke," Martha called out, and the name still felt strange to Mara's ears. "Might I have a word?" "Of course." Mara wiped her hands on her apron and gestured toward the porch. "Can I get you some water? You must be parched after that walk." "That would be lovely, thank you." They settled on the porch steps with cups of cool well water, and for a moment Martha just drank, her face flushed from exertion. She was a handsome woman in her mid-50s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of competent air that suggested she'd weathered her share of storms. "I'll be direct," Martha said finally. "Your brother has been making inquiries in town, asking questions about you and Mr. Rourke, about the nature of your marriage." Mara's stomach clenched. "What kind of questions?" "Whether it's real, whether you share a bed, whether he treats the children well, or if there's been any sign of impropriety." Martha's expression was sympathetic. "He's trying to build a case that your marriage is a sham, contracted solely to prevent him from taking custody." "It's not—" Mara stopped, because how could she explain? The marriage was real in the eyes of the law and the church, but it had been motivated by exactly the reasons Silas suspected. "We married for practical reasons," she said carefully. "But that doesn't make it any less legitimate." "I know that. You know that. But a judge might see it differently, especially if your brother can find people willing to testify that the marriage seems unconventional." Martha paused. "There's talk, Mrs. Rourke, about how quickly you remarried after your husband's death, about whether it's proper for a man and woman who barely know each other to be living under one roof with 6 children." "We're married," Mara said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. We have every right. Of course you do. I'm not questioning that. I'm simply warning you that others are. Martha set down her cup. The hearing is in 9 days. If you want the judge to rule in your favor, you need to present yourselves as a genuine family, not just two people sharing space out of convenience. How do we do that? You show affection. You present a united front. You make it clear that this is a true partnership, not just a legal arrangement. Martha's eyes were kind but direct. And you might consider attending church this Sunday. Let people see you together as a family. It would help counter some of the gossip. After Martha left, Mara found Caleb in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. He looked up as she entered, immediately reading the distress in her face. What happened? She told him about Martha's visit, about Silas's inquiries, about the gossip spreading through town like poison. Caleb listened without interrupting, his hands never stopping their steady motion along the horse's flank. She's right, he said when Mara finished. We need to seem more like a real married couple. We are a real married couple. You know what I mean. Caleb set down the brush and turned to face her. Right now we're living like friendly strangers who happen to share a house. I sleep in the barn. We barely touch. Anyone watching can see there's nothing between us. There isn't anything between us, Mara said quietly. Not like that. I know, but the judge don't need to know that. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. I ain't suggesting anything improper, but maybe we need to be more affectionate in public. Hold hands, stand closer, make it look like we actually care for each other. The idea made Mara's chest tight. Not because she found it repulsive. Caleb was a good man and she'd developed a deep respect for him over the past weeks. But because it felt like play acting, like cheapening something that should be sacred by turning it into performance. And you sleeping in the barn? Caleb continued. That needs to change too. He held up a hand quickly. Not the actual sleeping arrangements. But people can't know I'm out here. Far as anyone's concerned, we share that bedroom like proper husband and wife. So we lie. We present a version of the truth that serves our purposes, Caleb corrected gently. There's a difference. Is there? When it means keeping your children, yeah, there is. He was right, and Mara knew it, but the knowledge sat heavy in her stomach. She'd always tried to be honest, to live with integrity. Now she was being asked to deceive, not maliciously, but still. To create an illusion of intimacy that didn't exist. All right, she said finally. What do you need me to do? That Sunday, they went to church. All 8 of them crammed into the wagon, the children in their cleanest clothes, Mara in a dress she'd hastily altered to fit better, Caleb in a pressed shirt with his hair slicked back. They looked like a family, a real family, and Mara tried not to think about how much of that appearance was constructed. The church was small, a simple wooden building with crude benches and windows that let in more dust than light. It was already half full when they arrived, and Mara felt eyes turning toward them as they entered. Curious eyes. Judgmental eyes. Eyes that cataloged every detail. How close Caleb stood to her. Whether the children seemed happy. Whether there was any visible affection between husband and wife. Caleb must have felt it too, because as they slid into a pew near the back, he reached for Mara's hand. His palm was rough and warm, and the gesture felt both natural and completely foreign. She squeezed back, playing her part, and tried to focus on the minister's words rather than the weight of all that scrutiny. After the service, people approached them in the churchyard. Martha Brennan, with genuine warmth, introducing them to other members of the congregation. The Hendersons, who owned the general store and seemed friendly enough. The Caldwells, who had 6 children of their own and offered advice about managing such a large household. The Prices, whose daughter was about Sarah's age and who suggested the girls might like to play together sometime. And through it all, Caleb stayed close, his hand on the small of her back, his arm around her shoulders, small touches that said mine and together in a language everyone understood. Mara leaned into him, and tried to ignore how the children watched with a mixture of confusion and hope, like they couldn't quite figure out if this was real or pretend. You did well, Caleb said on the ride home. I felt like a fraud. You're protecting your children. That ain't fraud. It's not honesty either. Caleb was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses with practiced ease. You know what I think? I think there's different kinds of truth. There's the truth of facts. We got married for practical reasons. We don't share a bed. There's no romantic love between us. And then there's the truth of intention. I want to keep your family together. You want to be a good mother. We both care about what happens to these kids. The second one matters more than the first. Does it? When it comes to a judge deciding where 6 children belong, yeah, it does. Thomas was sitting up front with them, and he'd been quiet through the whole conversation. Now he spoke, his voice thoughtful. Papa used to say that sometimes you gotta do things that feel wrong because they're in service of something right. Mara turned to look at her son, surprised. When did he say that? Last winter, when he sold our extra blankets even though it meant we'd be cold. He said it felt wrong to sell something we needed, but it was right because it meant we could buy seed for spring planting. Thomas looked at her. This feels like that. Pretending you and Papa Caleb love each other might feel wrong, but it's right because it means we stay together. Out of the mouths of babes. Mara blinked back tears and nodded, not trusting her voice. The days continued to pass with relentless speed. Mara found herself hyper-aware of time, of how each sunset brought them closer to the hearing, to the moment when a stranger in a judge's robes would decide their fate. She threw herself into making everything perfect, keeping the cabin spotless, ensuring the children were clean and well-fed and happy, practicing the role of devoted wife until the performance started to feel almost natural, and Caleb matched her effort for effort. He moved into the main room at night, sleeping on a pallet by the fire so that if anyone came by unexpectedly, they'd find him inside rather than in the barn. He was more demonstrative with affection, ruffling the children's hair, pulling Mara close when others could see, creating the illusion of a family bound by love rather than necessity. In private moments, away from watching eyes, they'd drop the pretense. They'd sit on opposite ends of the porch and talk like the friends they were becoming, without the weight of performance. But those moments grew rarer as the hearing approached, and Mara sometimes found herself confused about where the act ended and reality began. One evening, 6 days before the hearing, Caleb asked Mara to walk with him. They left the children with Thomas in charge and headed up into the hills behind the cabin, where the pine trees grew thick and the evening air carried the scent of resin and earth. They walked in silence until they reached a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I wanted to talk to you away from the kids, Caleb said. Mara's heart clenched. Is something wrong? No, maybe. I don't know. He sat on a fallen log and gestured for her to join him. I've been thinking about the hearing, about what happens after. After? If we win, and I believe we will, then what? We stay married, I guess, keep living like we have been. But for how long? Forever? Until the kids are grown? What's the plan? Mara hadn't let herself think that far ahead. She'd been so focused on surviving the immediate crisis that the future beyond it felt impossibly distant. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose we'd have to stay married at least until Silas gives up trying to claim them. Maybe a year, 2? And then? Then, I don't know. An annulment, maybe? Or divorce? Caleb nodded slowly. That's practical. Makes sense. But something in his voice made Mara look at him more closely. Does it bother you, the idea of ending this eventually? Shouldn't it bother you more? You're the one giving up the chance to find love again someday. I had love, Mara said. I'm not looking for it again. You say that now, but you're young still. Might change your mind in a year or 2. And you? She turned the question back on him. Don't you deserve another chance at happiness? Caleb's laugh was bitter. I had my chance. Lightning don't strike twice. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. I want you to know, Caleb said finally, that whatever happens at the hearing, whatever the judge decides, I ain't gonna abandon you. Even if we lose and Silas takes the kids, which won't happen, but if it does, you'll still have a home here, for as long as you need it. The kindness of it undid her. Mara felt tears prick her eyes and turned away so he wouldn't see. Why? She whispered. Why are you so good to us? Because somebody should be, and because... He paused, choosing his words carefully.
because this past month, having you all here, it's reminded me what it feels like to have a purpose beyond just existing. The cabin ain't so quiet anymore. There's laughter and noise and life, and I didn't realize how much I missed that until I had it again.
Mara wiped her eyes and looked at him. We've disrupted your whole life. Yeah, best thing that ever happened to me, if I'm being honest. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not love, not romantic love anyway, but recognition, understanding. The acknowledgement that they'd both been drowning in different ways, and somehow, impossibly, they'd found in each other a lifeline. Thank you, Mara said softly, for everything, for saving us, for fighting for us, for being better than anyone had a right to expect. You're welcome. Caleb stood and offered her his hand. Come on, we should get back before Thomas decides he's in charge permanently. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and this time it wasn't for show. It was simply two people who'd learned to trust each other, offering comfort in the only way they knew how. The night before the hearing, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness of the bedroom, listening to her children breathe, and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Would the judge see through their performance? Would Silas's lawyers tear apart their story? Would she watch her children being led away, crying, reaching for her while she stood helpless? The thoughts circled like vultures, picking at her sanity. Finally, she gave up and slipped out of bed, moving quietly through the main room. Caleb was awake too. She could see him sitting by the dying fire, staring into the embers. Can't sleep either? He asked, without turning around. No. She sat beside him on the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Don't do that to yourself. How can I not? Everything depends on tomorrow. Everything. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You remember what I told you the day we met? That you weren't meant to carry things alone? Yes. That's still true. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. And if the worst happens, if somehow the judge rules against us, we'll figure out what comes next, together. He looked at her, his face serious in the firelight. You ain't alone anymore, Mara. That's the one thing I can promise you. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable, and Caleb let her cry. He didn't try to comfort her with empty reassurances or false hope. He just sat with her in the darkness, present and solid, while she finally let herself feel all the fear and grief and desperate love she'd been holding back. When the tears finally subsided, she felt empty, but somehow lighter, like she'd bled out poison and could finally breathe properly. We're gonna win, she said, and this time she almost believed it. Yeah, Caleb agreed. We are. They sat together until the fire burned down to ash and the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Then they stood, and without discussing it, Caleb pulled her into a brief, fierce hug. It was the first time they'd embraced without an audience, without performance, and it felt different. Real. Like maybe the lines between act and reality were blurring in ways neither of them had anticipated. Get some rest, he said. You're going to need your strength. Mara nodded and returned to the bedroom, where she finally fell into an exhausted sleep. And when she woke 2 hours later to the sound of the rooster crowing, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, not quite confidence, but something close to both. Something that said they had a chance, and sometimes a chance was all you needed. The day of the hearing dawned clear and hot, the kind of day where the sun seemed personal in its assault. They dressed carefully, Mara in her best dress, Caleb in his only suit, the children in their cleanest clothes. They loaded into the wagon in silence, the weight of what was coming pressing down on all of them. As they rode toward town, toward the courthouse, toward the moment that would determine everything, Caleb reached for Mara's hand one more time. She took it, and together they faced what came next. The courthouse sat at the edge of town like a tombstone, 2 stories of weathered brick with narrow windows that seemed to squint against the morning sun. Mara had passed it before on the few occasions she'd come to town with her first husband, but she'd never been inside, never had reason to. Now, as Caleb guided the wagon into the dusty yard beside it, the building seemed to loom larger than its actual size, casting shadows that felt prophetic. Other wagons and horses were already there. People who'd come to watch, Mara realized with a sick feeling. In small towns, a custody hearing was entertainment, drama, something to break the monotony of daily life. She could see faces she recognized from church: Martha Brennan and her husband, the Hendersons from the general store, others whose names she didn't know, but whose curious stares made her skin crawl. And there, climbing down from a hired carriage with the careful precision of a man afraid of soiling his expensive clothes, was Silas. He looked exactly as he had at the cabin, overdressed for the climate, every hair in place, his expression arranged in an expression of pious concern that made Mara want to scream. Beside him stood a man she didn't recognize, younger, carrying a leather satchel. A lawyer, probably. Of course Silas would bring a lawyer. "Easy," Caleb murmured, his hand on her elbow, steadying her as she climbed down from the wagon. "Remember what we talked about. Present a united front, show affection, make it clear they were a real family." Mara nodded and forced herself to breathe. The children tumbled out of the wagon bed, unusually subdued. Even Joseph, who was normally a whirlwind of energy, stayed close to Thomas, his small hand gripping his older brother's shirt. They knew. Somehow, despite Mara's attempts to shield them, they understood that today would determine whether they stayed together or were torn apart. "Mrs. Rourke," Silas's voice carried across the yard, formal and cold. "Mr. Rourke, children." Caleb moved slightly in front of Mara, not aggressively, just present, protective. "Ward, I trust you've prepared yourselves for today's proceedings?" Silas's eyes moved to the children, cataloging them like livestock. "The judge will want to speak with them, I'm sure. Assess their living conditions, their education, their general welfare." "They're fine," Mara said, hearing the edge in her own voice. "They're healthy and happy and loved." "We shall see what the court determines." Silas turned away dismissively. "Good day." They filed into the courthouse with the other spectators. The children pressed close on either side of Mara and Caleb. The interior was dim and smelled of old wood and tobacco smoke. The main room held wooden benches arranged like church pews, facing a raised platform where a scarred desk sat empty. Behind it, an American flag hung limply in the still air. They took seats near the front, and Mara tried not to think about how this felt like preparing for an execution. Her execution, the death of her family as she knew it. People settled around them, their voices a low murmur that felt simultaneously too loud and not loud enough. Mara caught fragments of conversation. "Married so quickly. Barely knows the man." Those poor children, and had to resist the urge to turn around and shout at them. These people knew nothing. They'd seen her suffering from a distance but had done nothing to help, and now they sat in judgment as if they had any right. "All rise." The bailiff's voice cut through the room, and everyone stood as the judge entered. He was older than Mara expected, 70 at least, with a shock of white hair and a face mapped with wrinkles. He wore simple black robes and moved with the careful slowness of a man whose bones ached. When he sat, everyone else followed suit, the benches creaking under the weight of collective anticipation. "This is a hearing regarding custody of 6 minor children," the judge said, his voice surprisingly strong for his age. "Silas Ward, petitioner, versus Mara Rourke, respondent. Mr. Ward, you filed the initial claim?" Silas stood, and his lawyer stood with him. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm seeking custody of my late brother-in-law's children on the grounds that their mother is unable to provide adequate care." "And what evidence do you present for this claim?" The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and a pinched expression, stepped forward. "Your Honor, at the time the petition was filed, Mrs. Fielding, now Mrs. Rourke, was living in extreme poverty. Her husband had recently died, she had no means of support, and the children were suffering from malnutrition and neglect. My client, Mr. Ward, is a successful attorney with ample resources to provide these children with proper housing, education, and opportunities they could never receive on the frontier." "I see." The judge's eyes moved to Mara. "Mrs. Rourke, what is your response to these allegations?" Mara stood, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. "Your Honor, it's true that times were hard after my husband died, but I've since remarried. My new husband, Caleb Rourke, owns property and has resources. The children are healthy now, well-fed and happy.
They're with their mother who loves them, in a stable home. A marriage that occurred quite recently, I understand? The judge glanced at some papers in front of him. Just 2 weeks ago? Yes, sir. Rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Mara felt the trap closing, but forced herself to meet the judge's eyes. It may seem that way, Your Honor, but the truth is that Mr. Rourke and I had been living together for over a month before we married.
He offered us shelter when we had none, and over that time we developed feelings for each other.
The marriage was a natural progression. It wasn't entirely a lie. They had developed feelings, just not romantic ones. But respect, trust, genuine care for each other's welfare, weren't those feelings too? Silas's lawyer spoke up. Your Honor, it's quite clear that this marriage is a legal fiction created solely to circumvent my client's legitimate claim. Mrs. Rourke married this man, whom she barely knows, purely to present a facade of stability. That's not true, Caleb said, standing. His voice was quiet but carried weight. Begging your pardon, Your Honor, but I married Mara because I care about what happens to her and her children. Maybe it happened fast, but that don't make it any less real. The judge studied them both, his expression unreadable. Mr. Rourke, describe your living situation. How many rooms in your home? 2, sir. Main room with kitchen and a bedroom. And all 8 of you live there? Yes, sir. It's snug, but it works. Where do the children sleep? The youngest ones with their mother in the bed. The older ones on the floor in the same room. I sleep in the main room. Mara's heart sank. That was exactly the wrong thing to say. It made their marriage sound like exactly what Silas was claiming, a legal arrangement rather than a real union. The judge's eyebrows rose. You sleep separately from your wife? The bedroom ain't big enough for all of us, Caleb said. Seemed more important that the children have space and comfort. How noble, Silas's voice dripped with sarcasm. A husband who doesn't share his wife's bed. Very convincing. Mr. Ward, you'll speak when spoken to, the judge said sharply. Then to Caleb, this arrangement does seem unusual for a married couple. We make it work, Caleb replied. The children's needs come first. The judge made a note, and Mara could practically see their case crumbling.
She'd known the sleeping arrangements would be a problem, but hearing it laid out in court made it sound even worse than she'd feared. Your Honor, Silas's lawyer said, I'd like to call a witness, Mrs. Dorothy Keene, who runs the boarding house in town. A middle-aged woman Mara vaguely recognized stood and made her way to the front. She was sworn in and took a seat, her expression nervous but determined. Mrs. Keene, the lawyer said, you've had occasion to observe Mr. Rourke prior to his marriage. Is that correct? Yes, sir. He's stayed at my boarding house several times when he comes to town for supplies. And during these stays, did he ever mention being courted by or courting a widow with 6 children? No, sir. Never mentioned no woman at all, actually. Kept to himself mostly. And after his marriage, did his behavior change? Well, Mrs. Keene glanced at Mara apologetically. He still seemed like the same man, quiet, polite. Didn't act like a man in love, if you know what I mean. No happiness about him, no lightness, just the same as always. Thank you, Mrs. Keene. The woman returned to her seat, and Mara felt the weight of her testimony settling over the room. The lawyer called 2 more witnesses, men who'd known Caleb for years and testified that he'd never shown interest in remarrying, never mentioned wanting a family, had seemed content in his solitude. Each testimony built the same picture. This marriage was out of character, suspicious, obviously constructed for legal purposes. Your Honor, Silas's lawyer said, the evidence is clear. This marriage is a sham designed to give the appearance of stability while allowing Mrs. Rourke to maintain custody. My client offers these children a genuine home with genuine resources. Not a frontier cabin with 8 people crammed into 2 rooms, not a hastily arranged marriage between strangers, but a proper household with education and opportunities. The judge was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I'd like to speak with the children, starting with the oldest. Mara's heart stopped. This was it, the moment when everything could fall apart. If Thomas said the wrong thing, if any of the children revealed that Caleb and Mara barely knew each other, that the marriage was motivated by fear rather than love. Thomas stood and walked to the front with a steadiness that belied his 10 years.
He was sworn in and sat in the chair, his small frame almost swallowed by its size. "Son," the judge said gently, "I need you to answer some questions honestly. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Do you like living with Mr. Rourke?" Thomas glanced at Caleb, then back at the judge. "Yes, sir. Very much." "Why?" "Because he's kind. He teaches me things, how to work with horses, how to mend fences, how to be a man, I guess. And he cares about us, about all of us." "Does he discipline you, treat you harshly?" "No, sir. He's firm when he needs to be, but he ain't mean. Never raises his hand or his voice." "And your mother? Is she happy with him?" Thomas hesitated, and Mara held her breath. "She's better than she was. Before she was so tired all the time, so sad. Now she smiles sometimes, laughs. I think Papa Caleb makes her feel safe." The judge made a note. "You call him Papa Caleb?" "Yes, sir. Because he ain't my real papa. That was my father who died. But he's papa enough, if that makes sense." Something in the judge's expression softened slightly. "It makes perfect sense, son. Thank you." Thomas returned to his seat, and the judge called Sarah forward. She was more nervous, her voice barely above a whisper, but she said essentially the same things, that Caleb was kind, that they had enough food now, that she felt safe. One by one, the children testified. The twins together, since they refused to be separated. Lily, who cried but managed to say that she liked having Papa Caleb read to her at night. Even Joseph, who the judge questioned briefly and gently, asking only if he was happy. The boy's enthusiastic "yes" and subsequent rambling about the toys Caleb had carved him brought scattered smiles from the spectators. When the last child had testified, the judge sat back and steepled his fingers. "Mr. Ward, I understand your concerns. The initial reports of Mrs. Fielding's situation were indeed dire. However, circumstances have changed significantly. The children appear healthy and well cared for. They're clearly attached to Mr. Rourke and express no desire to leave." "They're children," Silas protested. "They don't understand what's in their best interest. I can provide them with education, with culture, with opportunities this frontier life will never offer." "Perhaps, but you can't provide them with their mother or with a man they've come to see as a father figure." The judge paused. "However, I do have concerns about the legitimacy of this marriage." Mara's stomach plummeted. They were going to lose. After everything, all the planning, all the performance, all the hope, they were going to lose. "Your Honor," a voice said from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Martha Brennan stood, her expression determined. "Mrs. Brennan," the judge said, surprised, "do you have something to add?" "If it please the court, I do." Martha walked forward, her sensible boots clicking on the wooden floor. "I'm the wife of Reverend Brennan. I performed the marriage ceremony for Mr. and Mrs. Rourke, and I've observed them since." "And what have you observed?" "That they care deeply for each other, even if it's not expressed in conventional ways." Martha looked at Mara, then at Caleb, her expression kind. "I've been married 32 years, Your Honor, long enough to know that love takes many forms. These two may not have married for romantic reasons, but what I see between them is real. It's respect and partnership and genuine concern for each other's welfare. That's the foundation of any good marriage." "They barely know each other," Silas's lawyer interjected. "My husband and I had known each other 3 weeks when we married," Martha replied calmly. "Frontier life doesn't always allow for long courtships. You marry quickly because you need partnership to survive. That doesn't make those marriages any less valid." Other voices rose from the spectators. Henderson from the general store testifying that Caleb had been buying more supplies lately, food and fabric and things for children. The Caldwells saying they'd seen the family at church and they seemed as unified as any family they'd known. Others Mara didn't even recognize, speaking up in their defense. And Mara realized with a jolt of surprise that they'd become part of the community without even knowing it. That people who'd been strangers weeks ago had been watching, and what they'd seen was a family, imperfect, unconventional, but real. The judge raised his hand for silence. "I've heard enough." He looked at Silas, then at Mara and Caleb. "Mr. Ward, your concerns come from a good place. You want what's best for these children, and I believe that's sincere. However, the law is clear.
Unless there's evidence of abuse or severe neglect, children belong with their natural parent when possible. Mrs. Rourke has demonstrated that she can provide adequate care. She has a home, a husband with resources, and the children are thriving under her care. Your Honor, Silas started. I'm not finished. The judge's voice was stern. The marriage may have been contracted quickly and perhaps partially for legal reasons. But I've seen enough marriages in my time to know that motivation doesn't determine validity. What matters is the reality of the situation now, and what I see is a family that functions, that cares for each other, that meets the children's needs. He turned to Mara. Mrs. Rourke, I'm denying Mr. Ward's petition. The children will remain in your custody. The relief hit Mara like a physical blow. Her legs went weak, and if Caleb hadn't been there to catch her, she would have fallen. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some approving, some disappointed at losing their entertainment. However, the judge continued, and Mara's brief joy faltered. I want to be clear. This ruling is conditional. I'll be asking the county to do a follow-up visit in 6 months. If at that time there's any evidence that the children are being neglected or that the marriage was indeed a sham that has since dissolved, we'll revisit this decision. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Mara managed. Thank you so much. Silas stood, his face dark with fury. This is unconscionable. Those children deserve better than… Mr. Ward. The judge's voice cut through like a knife. You've had your say. The decision is made. I suggest you accept it with grace. Silas stared at Mara with such hatred that she instinctively moved closer to Caleb. Then he turned on his heel and stalked out, his lawyer scrambling to follow. The judge banged his gavel. We're adjourned. People crowded around them immediately, Martha hugging Mara, others offering congratulations, the children crying with relief and confusion in equal measure. Through it all, Caleb stood steady, his hand on Mara's back, anchoring her to reality when everything felt like a dream. They made their way outside into the brilliant sunshine, and Mara had to blink against the sudden brightness. The world looked different somehow, sharper, more vivid, like she was seeing it clearly for the first time in months. We won, she said, still not quite believing it. We did. Caleb smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. Your kids are staying with you. Our kids, Thomas corrected, appearing at Caleb's side. Right? We're a family now? Caleb's expression went soft. Yeah, son. I reckon we are. The ride home was nothing like the tense silence of the morning journey. The children chattered excitedly, their relief manifesting in noise and energy that Mara would normally have tried to quiet but now just let wash over her. They'd won. Against all odds, against Silas's money and lawyers and righteous certainty, they'd won. But as the cabin came into view, Mara felt a different kind of tension settling in. They'd won the battle, but now they had to live with the aftermath. 6 months until the follow-up visit. 6 months of maintaining the fiction of their marriage, of living as husband and wife when they were really just, what? Friends? Partners? Something without a name? That night, after the children were finally asleep, exhausted from emotion and celebration, Mara found Caleb on the porch. He was whittling something by lamplight, his hands moving with practiced precision. Can't sleep? He asked without looking up. Too much thinking. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. About what happens now. We keep doing what we've been doing. Raise the kids, work the land, live. For 6 months? And then what? And then the county comes, sees everything's fine, and leaves us alone. Caleb glanced at her. Unless you're wanting out? We could wait until the follow-up is done and then dissolve things if that's what you want. Did she want that? Mara tried to imagine returning to her old life, alone with her children, struggling to survive, carrying everything on her own shoulders again. The thought made her tired just considering it. I don't know what I want, she admitted. A month ago, I wanted to keep my children fed and alive. Now I have that, and I should be grateful. But instead, I'm just confused. About what? About us. About this. She gestured vaguely at the space between them. We're married, but we're not. We care about each other, but it's not love. We're partners, but we're also strangers. I don't know what we are. Caleb set down his whittling and was quiet for a long moment. You know what I think? I think we're whatever we decide to be. Ain't nobody else's business but ours. The judge made it his business. 6 months from now. 6 months from now, he'll see a family that works. That's all that matters. Caleb turned to face her fully. Look, I know this ain't conventional. I know you married me for the wrong reasons, and I married you for maybe the right reasons, but in the wrong way. But here we are, and maybe instead of worrying about what we should be, we just be. See where it goes. And if it goes nowhere, then we've still got partnership and respect and a shared purpose. That's more than a lot of marriages have. He was right, Mara realized. They didn't need to define this or force it into a shape it wasn't meant to take. They could just exist as they were. Two broken people who'd found in each other something like healing, even if it didn't look like the storybook said it should. All right, she said. We'll see where it goes. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm, different from the tense performance of before. With the immediate threat gone, they could relax into themselves, into each other. Caleb moved back to sleeping in the barn most nights, though no one was checking anymore. They didn't hold hands unless it felt natural. They spoke honestly rather than carefully, and slowly something shifted. It started small. Caleb bringing Mara coffee in the mornings without her asking. Mara mending his favorite shirt with extra care. Small gestures of consideration that went beyond obligation. Then larger things. Caleb teaching not just Thomas, but all the children to read and cipher, spending patient hours helping them sound out words by lamplight. Mara staying up late to finish a shirt she was making for him, wanting it to fit properly, wanting him to look nice. They worked side by side in the garden, their movements synchronized without needing to coordinate. They shared private jokes about the chickens' personalities. They debated whether to plant corn or wheat next spring, and when they disagreed, they compromised rather than one simply deferring to the other. And one evening in late September, when the heat had finally broken and the air carried the first hint of autumn, Mara looked across the table at Caleb helping Joseph with his letters and felt something catch in her chest. Not love, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that whispered maybe. That night, as they sat on the porch in the cooling air, Mara said, "I'm glad it was you." Caleb looked at her, puzzled. "What?" "That day on the ridge, when you saw us. I'm glad it was you who stopped and not someone else." "Yeah?" "Yeah." She smiled. "I think we're going to be all right, Caleb Rourke." "I think you might be right, Mara Rourke." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one, and Mara felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the sensation. Peace. The follow-up visit came in early March, just as the land was beginning to show the first tentative signs of spring. The county inspector was a tired-looking man named Morrison, who seemed more interested in getting the visit over with than in finding problems. He walked through the cabin, asked the children a few cursory questions, noted that everyone appeared healthy and adequately clothed and fed, and signed his papers with obvious relief. "Everything seems in order," he told Mara and Caleb. "The court will receive my report, but I see no reason for further concern." When he left, Mara found herself fighting tears. It was truly over. Silas had no more claims, no more legal recourse. Her children were hers, permanently and irrevocably. But that evening, as they sat down to dinner, all 8 of them crowded around the table that Caleb and Thomas had extended to fit everyone, she realized something else. They weren't hers anymore. Not just hers. They were theirs. Somewhere in the past months, without anyone quite noticing when it happened, they'd stopped being 2 separate entities joined by legal necessity and had become something unified. A family not by blood or by law, but by choice, by daily acts of care and sacrifice, by the 1,000 small ways they'd learned to accommodate and support and love each other. That night, Mara didn't go to the bedroom immediately after the children were asleep. Instead, she stayed in the main room where Caleb was banking the fire for the night. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "I've been thinking about our arrangement." He straightened, and something in his expression went guarded. "Yeah?" "The bedroom. It's bigger than we need for just me and the littlest ones, and you're getting too old to be sleeping on the floor of the barn every night." "I manage fine." "I know, but—" She took a breath. "What if we divided it? Hung a curtain down the middle. You could have actual privacy and a real bed, and I'd still have space for the children who need me close. Caleb was very still. You sure about that? I'm sure that you deserve better than what you've had. You've given us everything, and you sleep in a barn. It's not right. Mara, I don't want you to feel like I don't feel anything except grateful. And maybe, she paused, looking for the right words, maybe like this is what family does. They make space for each other. Something in Caleb's expression softened. All right then, if you're sure. I'm sure. They hung the curtain 2 days later, a heavy canvas that divided the room neatly in half. Caleb moved his few possessions in, and for the first time since they'd married, they truly shared the space. It was strange at first, hearing him move around on the other side of the curtain, knowing he was there even when she couldn't see him. But it also felt right somehow, like a family should be, close but with boundaries, together but with respect for privacy. Spring turned to summer, and with it came abundance. The garden flourished under their combined care. The chickens produced more eggs than they could eat, and they sold the surplus in town. Caleb and Thomas, working together, repaired the roof and built an addition to the cabin, a separate room for the boys, giving everyone more space. And somewhere in the midst of all that work and growth, Mara realized something startling. She was happy, not the delirious happiness of new love, or the satisfaction of meeting others' expectations. Just the quiet, steady happiness of a life that worked, of children who thrived, of days filled with purpose and nights filled with rest. She was standing in the garden one July evening watching Caleb teach Joseph how to identify ripe tomatoes when Thomas appeared at her elbow. Ma? You love him, don't you? The question should have surprised her, but somehow it didn't. Yes, she said simply. I do. Does he know? I don't know. Maybe. Does it matter? Thomas smiled. Reckon he loves you too, even if neither of you have said it. What makes you think that? The way he looks at you when he thinks nobody's watching, like you're, I don't know, like you're the best thing that ever happened to him. Mara's eyes burned and she blinked hard. You're too observant for your own good. Pa used to say that too. Thomas's expression went wistful. I miss him, but I'm glad we got Papa Caleb. I think Pa would be glad too. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet except for the usual creaks and sighs, Mara stood at the curtain dividing their room. She could see lamplight glowing through the canvas, could hear Caleb moving around as he prepared for bed. Caleb? Yeah? Can I come over there? A pause, then, yeah, course. She pulled the curtain aside and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, pulling off his boots. He looked up at her, his expression cautious but open. Something wrong? No, I wanted to say thank you for everything, for all of it. You've thanked me before. I know, but I don't think I really meant it before. Not like I mean it now. She sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. You saved us, Caleb, not just from starvation or from Silas. You saved us from giving up, from losing who we are. You saved yourself, Caleb said quietly. I just gave you the space to do it. No, we saved each other. She looked at him, at this man who'd become so essential to her life she couldn't imagine it without him. I know this wasn't what either of us planned, but I'm glad it happened anyway. Me too. They sat in silence for a moment, and then, moving without thinking about it, Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. Caleb stiffened for a second, then relaxed, his arm coming around her in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. I love you, Mara whispered. I didn't think I'd ever say that to anyone again. But it's true. I love you. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought maybe he hadn't heard. Then, I love you too. Have for a while now, I think. Just didn't know how to say it. Mara lifted her head to look at him, and what she saw in his face took her breath away. Not passion or intensity, but something steadier. Something that looked like home. When he kissed her, it was gentle and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. And maybe they did. Maybe that was the gift they'd been given, not a fairy tale romance, but something better, Something real and hard-won and built on a foundation of respect and sacrifice and genuine care. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "So," Caleb said, "what happens now?" "Now?" Mara glanced at the curtain, at the careful division they'd maintained. "Now I think we stop pretending we need that curtain." "Yeah?" "Yeah." They took it down the next morning, working together to fold the heavy canvas and store it in the barn. The children watched with knowing smiles, and Mara realized they'd probably figured out what was happening long before she had. Life continued, but different now, better. They still worked hard, the land demanded it, but the work felt lighter somehow, shared between two people who'd chosen each other not once but repeatedly, in 1,000 small daily choices. In August, Mara discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to believe it, afraid to hope. But when the nausea and fatigue became undeniable, she had to accept the truth. She told Caleb one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He'd gone very still, his expression unreadable. "You sure?" "Pretty sure." "How do you feel about it?" Mara thought about it. Another child, another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, another life to be responsible for. A year ago, the thought would have terrified her, but now... "Happy," she said, surprised to find it was true. Scared, but happy. Caleb's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. "Me too." The baby came in early March, on a night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the air carried the promise of spring. Mara labored in the bedroom with Martha Brennan attending her, while Caleb waited in the main room with the children. It was nothing like her previous births. There was no fear, no grinding poverty, no husband dying in the next room. Just pain and work, and the knowledge that on the other side of it waited new life. When the baby finally arrived, a girl with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair, Martha cleaned her off and placed her in Mara's arms. "She's beautiful," Martha said. "What will you name her?" Mara looked down at the tiny face, at the eyes that would probably be brown like Caleb's, at the impossible perfection of miniature fingers and toes. She thought about everything they'd been through to get to this moment, the hunger and fear and desperation, but also the kindness and sacrifice and love that had saved them. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Caleb came in then, moving quietly, his face full of wonder. The other children crowded in behind him, jostling to see their new sister. "She's so small," Lily whispered. "Were we that small?" Samuel asked. "Smaller," Mara said, smiling. "All of you were much smaller." Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, and Mara shifted the baby so he could see her properly. His hand came up to touch her tiny head, his fingers gentle against the soft skull. "Hello, Hope," he murmured. "Welcome to the family." And looking around at all of them, her husband, her children, the baby in her arms, Mara felt something settle deep in her chest. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a rescue, but a transformation. They'd come through fire and drought and desperation, and somehow, impossibly, they'd emerged on the other side not broken, but stronger. They'd become something none of them had planned, but all of them needed. A family knit together not by blood or circumstance alone, but by choice and love, and the daily act of showing up for each other. "Thank you," she whispered to Caleb. "For what?" "For stopping that day, for seeing us, for staying." Caleb smiled, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of everything they'd built together. "Thank you for letting me." That night, after Martha had left and the children were finally asleep and the baby nursed and settled, Mara stood at the window looking out at the land. The same land that had once seemed so hostile, so unforgiving. Now, in the moonlight, it looked almost gentle, full of possibility. Caleb came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, and she leaned back against his chest. "You know what I was thinking?" she said. "What?" "That day you rode up. If you'd kept going, if you hadn't stopped," she shook her head, "everything would be different. But I did stop. Why?" "Really?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Because I knew what it felt like to be drowning, and I couldn't watch someone else go under without at least throwing a rope. I'm glad you did." "Me too." They stood together in the darkness, holding each other, holding hope, holding the future they'd built from nothing. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to the moon. And inside the cabin, warm and full and alive with the sound of breathing children, a family slept. Not the family anyone had planned, not the family the storybooks promised, but a family nonetheless. Real, imperfect, whole. And that was more than enough. That was everything.